Tales of the Caballos by William H. White. Part 1 is about the early history. Part 1, Chapter 3, Padre LaRue. Padre LaRue was a Jesuit monk who arrived in Mexico City with his group of fellow French Jesuits around the early 1600s. Because his group's primary language was not Spanish, they were treated poorly by the authorities of the Catholic Church, then stationed in Mexico City. Padre LaRue and his group were eventually regulated to an insignificant parish someplace in what is now the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. It was in this parish where the majority of the native population were treated little better than chattels by the Spanish that LaRue began what was to be his life work. The records are sketchy as to why Padre LaRue migrated almost 400 miles to the north with his parishioners, but it is well known that this is what took place. Padre LaRue first located in what is now known as the Cabo Mountains, a rather spectacular pile of rocks located just to the east of what is now Las Cruces, New Mexico. His foundations can be seen in the ruins of the hotels that flourished there in the early 1900s. The place is now called Dripping Springs and is administered by the Bureau of Land Management. The hike into this place is well worth the effort. The ruins are well hidden to the west of the spring in the heart of the canyon, while surrounded by trees and brush. It is not known at this writing just how long Padre LaRue and his followers stayed at this location, but the Jesuit stories as it relates to the Caballo Mountains is the meat of this writing. The Caballo Mountains lie almost due north of the Cabo Mountains, about 65 miles as the crow flies. The Jesuits established 9 missions in and around the Caballo Mountains, and soon were flourishing with the help of the original parishioners, as well as help from the friendly Apache Indians who had villages near there on the Rio Grande River. These missions were established with 2 criteria in mind. First, there had to be year-round water available, and secondly, there had to be gold that could be mined close by. The Jesuits believed that they answered to no one but the Pope in Rome, and their mission here in the New World was to create new riches for the Church. This policy proved to be their undoing in the later years. During this era, the Jesuits were left to themselves by the Spanish authorities as they went about their business of mining and stockpiling gold. Secondly, in the minds of the Jesuits, they were dedicated to saving the souls of the poor, ignorant Native Americans who happened to be living close by. I am certain that the Jesuits gained access to the mountain during their tenure here. Eyewitnesses have reported seeing hastily stacked coffins and church records in the bowels of the mountain. Padre LaRue eventually died and was buried by the Apache Indians in the mountain. He was sitting at his desk with his papers around him when seen by both Buster Ward and Willie Dohit. These two simply went about removing gold bars and had little use with disturbing the dead. Doc Noss, on the other hand, did not share this fear of disturbing the spirits. It was from under the hand of Padre LaRue that Doc Noss located the maps and descriptions that eventually took him to Victorio Peak on what is now the White Sands Missile Range. I am fairly certain that Padre LaRue is buried on the Caballo Mountains, and much of what we know of him today we owe to Doc Noss. It is not known how much gold was hoarded by the Jesuits, but it was safe to say that it was substantial. The Jesuits were on the Caballo Mountains about 60 years until events beyond their control caused them to abandon these mountains forever. Given the human resource and the time the Jesuits had to mine and hoard gold, the actual numbers would be staggering. No one can begin to estimate the value of the gold mined and stockpiled during the era. It was well known that few of these Jesuit gold bars eventually reached Europe because of the Jesuits' refusal to pay the king's taxes on gold produced in the New World. The real tragedy struck around 1680 during the depths of the worst drought in the history of New Mexico. It was this drought that triggered what was to become known as the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. The drought was so severe that the Rio Grande River went dry, the game left the area, and the crops failed. The Indians blamed the Spanish. It was certainly their fault that the gods were angry and punished the Indians with this drought. The Indians saw no difference between the Spanish and the Jesuits. All must be driven off or killed to end this tragedy. The Jesuits hastily closed up the mines they were working, buried the church records and artifacts, and ran for their lives. The Spanish were driven back to El Paso del Norte, to the south, and did not return for 30 years. The Jesuits never returned to the Caballo Mountains. They had fallen into disfavor by the Spanish crown, and many went back to Spain in chains. The Jesuits were eventually replaced by the Franciscans, who were more than willing to pay taxes. The old missions on the Caballo Mountains were never reopened. The mines worked by the Jesuits were hidden by the Indians during the revolt, and most were forgotten, never to be reopened again. The Jesuits were gone forever from this part of New Mexico, but they left their mark on the mountain. There is no doubt that these enterprising Europeans left hoard after hoard of gold bars, most of which is waiting to this day for some lucky treasure hunter to stumble onto it.